it's hot. 1:16, looking at the lesson, I'm going to finish this lesson on why the Jews rejected Jesus. And we spent some time last week looking at the phrase and the account of Jesus and John the Baptizer, where the statement was made, we have piped to you and you have not danced. We have lamented and you have not mourned. And then Jesus said, John the Baptist came neither eating or drinking. You said he had a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. And you said he's a glutton and a wine bibber. He says, but wisdom is justified by her children. And that's where we stopped. That's where we stopped somewhat last week, looking at that phrase, wisdom is justified by her children. And there are some things that we want to continue with in that line of thinking. And in page 116, in the lower paragraph, the second paragraph there, it says that John's way of life and his teaching, this is in the middle of that paragraph, were so foreign to their ideas and so antagonistic to their practices, and being blinded by their own conceit, their thinking had become so distorted, but that they not only rejected John, but justified that rejection by the rationalization that he had a demon. In other words, we don't want to believe John. We don't like the way John lives. We don't like what John says. We don't like the life that John has called us to. Therefore, we're going to find some way to reject that on a grounds that salves our consciences and is satisfactory to us as a whole. Now, incidentally, even though they didn't say that about Jesus, in this case, they did say it about him in another case, in John chapter 8. Remember when Jesus had talked about what it meant to truly be free? John 8, 31, 32, if you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Verse 36, when the Son sets you free, you're free indeed. And then the Jews took umbrage at that statement. Wow, we're Abraham's children. We've never been in bondage to anybody. Really? Well, I would suggest that you might want to read the book of Exodus and the book of Judges and all of the books of the prophets and tell me that you've never been in bondage to anybody. And then you might want to look around and see who you're in bondage to right now. I mean, just the arrogance of that statement, the conceit behind that statement, to say such a ludicrous thing as if it were a fact, just shows how deeply embedded they were in their own way of thinking. And then when Jesus corrected them on that matter, they said, do we not rightly say that you are a Samaritan and have a devil, have a demon? Question, did they know if Jesus was a Samaritan or not? Of course they did. They knew who he was. They knew he wasn't a Samaritan. They accused him of being possessed of a devil. And then, when that wasn't good enough, they disproved the earlier statement and said, we weren't born to fornication. We weren't born to fornication. In other words, they admitted that they knew exactly who Jesus was because they could remember the account that was at least 30 years old of how he came into the world, that most people believed that Mary had been unfaithful before she married Joseph, and that he was born, or at least conceived, out of wedlock, and they full well knew that, so the statement about being a Samaritan was just hogwash, just a flat-out insult. Then the statement to his parentage is a statement which is called an ad hominem argument, which means it's an argument to the man. In other words, if I can't refute what you say, I'm going to attack you personally. Therefore, when I attack you personally, I don't have to listen to what you say. Now, if you want to see a perfect example, and you can do this or not, but a perfect example of an ad hominem argument is, I was watching, and I saw it actually when it happened about 20 years ago. It was was a show called Politically Incorrect, hosted by Bill Maher, who's a radical leftist, an atheist, hates all things Christian. We had a TV show called Politically Incorrect, where he supposedly had 2 conservatives and 2 liberals on his talk show, and everybody was just kind of free to say whatever they wanted to say. Well, on this particular episode, he had Ben Stein. Ben Stein was on. Ben Stein, famous conservative, well-known, actor, and so Ben Stein's here, and there's 3 liberals. One, some chick off of Baywatch, who was as dumb as a box of rocks, and then a professor, and then somebody else. All right? And so every time they'd say something, and Stein would sit there and he'd say, "That's just not true." And then he'd give the facts about what, like they say, "We're running out of food." He goes, "That's just not true." "We're running out of space on this planet for people." "Oh, that's just not true." And he just kept refuting them with fact after fact. "We're running out of fossil fuels." "Oh, that's just not true." And they just got more mad and more mad and more mad and more mad. And finally one of them said, here's what she said. She goes, "You worked for Nixon. Why should I listen to you?" Because he was a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. Therefore, that justifies me not listening to anything that you say. Now that's what the Jews did right here with John the Baptizer and with Christ himself. Is that they attacked the person as being unreliable rather than dealing with arguments because they couldn't deal with the arguments. Just like they couldn't deal with Ben Stein's arguments because truth was not on their side, they attacked him as a person to discredit his arguments. Look, truth is truth no matter who says it. Truth is truth. Look, atheists can speak truth, right? I mean, atheists can speak truth. Just anybody can speak truth. Well, there are a couple of people I have doubts about, but basically, the character of an individual does not determine whether or not what they say is true. The facts determine as to what they say is true. I mean, look, Billy Graham said a lot of true things in the course of his 60 years of preaching. All right? Who was the guy from Charles Stanley out of Atlanta? He said a lot of good things. His son Andy has said a lot of good things. These guys say a lot of good things. But whether or not, who they are is not the determination as to whether or not it's true. And so John is here and Jesus is here saying that you can't deal with facts. Therefore, you attack us as individuals. And therefore, when you attack us as individuals, you justify your rejection of the facts. Now, over to page 117. Jesus changes from John the Baptizer to himself. And by the way, the contrast between John and Jesus is, even though they were cousins, is pretty stark. Jesus was of the tribe of Judah. John was of the tribe of Levi. All right? Jesus did not come out of the wilderness. Jesus did not live an austere life. He did not live a life that was odd in relation to the rest of the populace. In other words, his food, his dress did not, it says here, his food and dress did not vary widely from that of the other people of his day. And so there was nothing in his daily life sufficiently radical to justify their reasoning in making such a charge against him as they made against John. So then they exaggerated his life. They exaggerated it. A glutton and a wine bibber. Now, was Jesus a glutton? No. Was he a wine bibber? No. He was living the exact same life that all of them were living, and yet they exaggerated his social life, misrepresented him, and classified him with the rabble. They rejected John because he abstained from the common practices of the day, and then they rejected Jesus because he followed the practices of the day. Now, what can you do with those people? What can be done with that kind of attitude? And the answer is absolutely nothing. And then, here's where we closed last week with this statement, wisdom is justified by her works or by her children. And the bottom line, the wisdom of an action is determined by the fruit or the result of it. Now, look over on page 118. In the middle of that top paragraph, beginning with the word certainly, end of about the 7th line, certainly. Certainly no action can be considered the part of wisdom unless the result therefrom is considered satisfactory. In other words, how wise or how unwise an action is, now get this, in part, because we're going to talk about this, is in part determined by the end result. Not totally determined by the end result, in part. But now note the next line. But this does not bar the influence of deceit in judging results. One may be deceived and think that the result of his decision or action is right and good when it is not. But so long as this is the case, he remains confident in his own wisdom, as Paul would say, wise in his own conceit. Now here's where I made a note to the side here. Church growth. Church growth. Is it possible that people think that church growth is always the direct result of God's blessing? And by the way, when I say church growth, I'm not talking about necessarily the Lord's church, but it could be the Lord's church. Okay? I'm just talking about a congregation of people. Here's a congregation of people. All of a sudden, over the course of 10 years, they go from 100 to 500. Maybe they hire a new preacher. Maybe they're doing something, and the congregation goes from 100 to 500 in 5 or 10 years. Now, what are the people of that congregation going to say about that situation? What are they going to say, John? The blessing from the Lord. Yeah, we wouldn't be growing if the Lord wasn't blessing us.
That had nothing to do with the gymnasium or the band or the buses.
That's exactly. Did you hear me say it? Has nothing to do with the gymnasium or the band or whatever, whatever thing that they're doing to draw in crowds. It's obviously the Lord's blessing. Now, can churches grow with the Lord's blessing? Well, sure they can. All right? But can churches grow without the Lord's blessing? No, growth is not the only or final or even the main result of God's blessing. Question. Did God bless the 2 faithful churches of Asia in Revelation 2 and 3? Did He bless them? Did He bless the 2 faithful churches? Yes or no? Did He bless the church at Philadelphia and the church at Smyrna? Did He bless them? Yes or no? All right, let me say this. I'm going to say it real slow. Did God bless the 2 faithful churches in Asia? Yes or no? Yes. Thank you, Linda. Yes, He blessed them. Did He bless them with growth? No. Growth was not a sign of the blessing of those churches. Question. Do you think the Laodicean church was growing? Do you think they were growing? We are rich and have need of nothing. Think that church is growing? Probably was. Was God blessing them with growth? Was that growth the source of God's blessing? No. No, it wasn't. What about the church that was teaching people to eat meat offered to idols and practice fornication? By the way, if you could teach that fornication would be a part of religious service, you could bust them out at the seams overnight, right? Isn't that right? If a church started teaching that you didn't have to be married or faithful to your spouse and you could still go to heaven, do you think that church would bust wide open? Sure it would. Sure it would. So would that be the blessing from the Lord? Well, we're growing. Lord must be blessing us. Oh. And so we can be deceived. We can be deceived into thinking we're doing things right because we're growing. By the way, some churches, particularly in urban areas, grow because the urban areas are growing, or I should say the suburban areas are growing. You build a church. Well, I'll give you an example. And by the way, this is not an indictment or a statement against either one of these congregations, all right? Because as far as I know, they're both faithful churches, all right? But 25 years ago, there was one fairly small congregation in Spring Hill, Tennessee. 25 years ago, there was one small congregation in Spring. Y'all know where Spring Hill is? If you're going to Nashville and you're going up 65, before you get to Franklin, there's an exit. It's called the Spring Hill Columbia exit. And if you were going on a direct line from Franklin to Columbia, you'd go through Spring Hill. All right? And now there's two congregations in Spring Hill that have about 400 or 500 members. Now, do you know what happened to Spring Hill? About 50,000 people moved there. You know? So did those churches grow? Those congregations grew. And again, I'm not saying anything against either congregation because I know the preachers at both places and like both those guys. And I have even kinfolks that worship at those places, all right? But those congregations can grow, but the Lord's church doesn't have to necessarily grow, right? Because if somebody goes from here to here, the congregation grows, but it's still a net zero, right? And so it's not even necessarily that the Lord's blessed either one of those congregations because of growth. It may just be that a whole bunch of people moved in. I mean, you can be a faithful church in an inner city, and people can start leaving the inner city, and you can be just as faithful as you can be, and you can start losing members. And it has nothing to do with the Lord's blessing or curse, right? So we want to think about things in the right way. When we hear things or see things, we want to be discerning in the way that we react and respond to those things. Now, over to I want to go top of page 19 because basically everything on 118 is what we just talked about. But in Luke 7 and verse 30, is a follow-up statement to verse 29. It speaks about the people who justified God being baptized with the baptism of John. It says they justified God. Now, it's kind of a misleading statement. What it means is they deemed God worthy of obedience. In other words, they determined in their mind that God was worthy to be obeyed and that John was God's messenger. Therefore, they responded to John's messenger and his message by being baptized. But verse 30 says, of the Pharisees, they rejected for themselves the counsel of God, not being baptized by John. Now, no. Do you think these individuals who rejected the teaching of John justified their rejection of him?
You think the individual justified?
Yeah, well, sure they did. Sure they justified their rejection of John and his teaching. But what did Jesus say that they had done?
Rejected him.
Rejected the counsel of God. When we refuse to obey God, we reject the counsel of God. And Jesus said the Pharisees rejected the counsel of God because they didn't obey the teaching of John the Baptizer. Now, look at the top of page 119, first full paragraph. If the Pharisees and lawyers rejected for themselves the counsel of God by not being baptized of John, is it not true today that when people refuse to accept the baptism taught by Jesus and his apostles, they are themselves rejecting the counsel of God? In other words, here's a situation in the first century. Here's God's messenger. Here's God's message. Here's a group of people who reject God's message or his messenger, and then, by extension, reject his message, and they don't obey it. What have they done? They've rejected the counsel of God. Now, here's a situation in the 21st century. By the way, it's been going on for 2,000 years. People reject God's messengers. People reject God's message. They don't obey it. And in so doing, they have rejected God's counsel against or for themselves because they've not submitted to the teaching of God that's given through his word and through his messengers. Now, moving on down, Matthew 28:18, Jesus said, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. That's a pretty strong statement, isn't it? All authority is given to me in heaven and on earth. Is there any area where Jesus failed to exercise authority in his earthly ministry? Any area where Jesus was denied authority? All right. What about in matters of nature? Did Jesus have authority over nature? How do we know? He walked on water. That's physics, but or gravity. But, all right, what else did he do? He caused
the fig tree to wither.
Caused fig tree to wither. He calmed the storms, calmed the seas.
He turned water into wine.
Turned water into wine. All right, so Jesus has all authority over nature. What about over sickness and disease? Did Jesus exert authority over all those things? Did Jesus exert authority over people in knowing what their thoughts were? Did Jesus know about things that happened in places where he was not present? All right, so when Jesus said, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth, that wasn't just blowing smoke. He had already demonstrated that, right? He'd already demonstrated. So right after Jesus says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth, he says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. How do you do that? Baptizing them into the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. In the very next line, after he says, all authority is given to me in heaven and earth, he gives this command. Disciples are made by baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then teaching them after you've done that. Now, how many people reject the counsel of God against themselves in that matter? Go ahead, John.
Before you got too far, I was going to say, when we fail to preach and teach the truth here, we reject.
That's exactly right. It's not just a matter of failing to obey it. If we fail to teach it,
if we pick and choose what we want to teach, then we're out of this place.
That's right. We reject the counsel of God. Because
yes.
we're supposed to preach the whole counsel of God, like Paul said in Acts 20. I've not shunned to declare unto you the whole counsel of God. So when a congregation doesn't get teaching on marriage and divorce, instrumental music, or anything else, that church has rejected for themselves the counsel of God. And the elders are responsible because they don't demand that the counsel of God be taught on those subjects. Right? And so, going back to what Stroop said, anytime a person does not obey the teaching of the Bible, they reject the counsel of God for themselves. By the way, in Matthew 28:19, that's a direct parallel to Mark 16:16. It says, he who believes the gospel and is baptized shall be saved. So what do we learn from just those two statements? You cannot be a disciple, first of all, by hearing the gospel. You cannot be a disciple without obeying the gospel. And you cannot obey the gospel and become a disciple without being baptized for the remission of sins. All right? Now, going down right below where it says Matthew 28:19 and 20. I got to get to this. Jesus' disciples followed his instructions, right? They did exactly what he told them to do. They went and they preached the gospel to the whole world. And the people who heard the apostles did the same. Acts 8:4, they that were scattered abroad and everywhere preaching the word. They were following the counsel of God. Next line. Can we reject it without rejecting the counsel of God? No. The practice of accepting baptism as a form, but apart from the rest of Jesus' teaching, is not accepting the counsel of God. You hear that? Following the practice of baptism in form without the associated teaching with baptism is rejecting the counsel of God. In other words, the word baptism means immerse. I mean, that's what the word means. Nobody argues that. You can't argue. I mean, that's what the word means. It means to be immersed. Right? But baptism is not just about being immersed. Baptism is about being immersed in response to hearing and believing the gospel of Christ and receiving the remission of sins. A number of weeks ago, I made a statement and was telling you about this, and maybe I don't remember if it was in Bible class or a sermon. But Roman Catholicism used to Christianize their conquered people. In other words, they'd go in and they'd conquer a people, and then they'd march them down at the end of a spear and immerse them in a river to Christianize them. In other words, you either go down the river and you're immersed, or we're going to kill you. Now that's baptism in form, right? But it's not associated with any of the other teaching that accompanies baptism. And by the way, what he's describing right here is Baptist doctrine. Do they practice the form of baptism? Sure they do. They practice immersion. But do they demand it? No. Listen. I'm not talking about as a condition of salvation. I'm saying, do they demand immersion? Or do Baptists practice sprinkling? Right. They don't practice sprinkling. They don't accept it. They don't practice pouring effusion. All right, they don't practice that. There's only one. That's where they got their name. Right. Their name comes from the practice of immersion. So the form is held as incontrovertible, non-negotiable. But there's absolutely no doctrine attached to it. In other words, the doctrine that Jesus himself attached to baptism is rejected by the Baptist church. So therefore, they're holding to baptism as a form, but not holding to anything in regard to the doctrine that the Bible teaches about baptism. Now question, is that Bible baptism? No. Just because a person or a group practices immersion does not mean they're practicing Bible baptism. Colossians chapter 2 and verses 11 and 12 teach us two things about baptism. One, it's a burial. It's a burial. We are buried with him by baptism. Secondly, it teaches us this. It's an act of faith. You are buried with him in baptism, wherein you are also raised in faith in God, or the working of God, who raised him from the dead. In other words, there has to be the burial, there's the form. But there also has to be the faith with the form. That a person has to believe what God says about baptism in order to practice Bible baptism. So Colossians 2, 11 and 12 teach us there is a form, and the form's non-negotiable, but there's also an attached faith to the form that has to be present. You can't have well, it's kind of like worship in spirit and in truth. You can't have worship in spirit that's not in truth and be acceptable to God. And you can't have worship that's in truth, in form, that lacks the spirit attached to it that's pleasing to God. They both have to be present. Therefore, form is important, but insufficient of itself. And faith is important, but insufficient of itself. If I believed that I was remitted of my sins when they sprinkled water on me, I got the proper faith about baptism, but I got the form wrong. You see? And so what Stroop is teaching here and showing us is that it's not just enough to accept the form of the doctrine. There has to be the faith that accompanies the form. All right? And then on page 120, as we close out, Paul condemns the Jews. Of course, in Romans chapter 10 and verse 1, he says, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal for God, but it's not according to knowledge. And they, being ignorant of the righteousness of God, and having gone about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves to the righteousness of God, for Christ is the end of the law." Christ is the end of the law. The law's done. When Christ came, the law was done. Go ahead, Jay.
Right there. People that hold up the Ten Commandments.
People holding up the Ten Commandments are missing Romans 10:3 as this is, I mean...
There's a bunch of them.
Oh, sure there are. Sure there are. But note the statement that he makes in the middle of the page. It seems that their faith in the righteousness of God had ceased. They had come to trust in their own righteousness. They failed to see the law as an opportunity to show their faith in God, but rather they put their trust in their ability to follow the law as the means of their justification. Remember the Pharisee and the publican? "Lord, I thank you I'm not like other men are." You know, and he went through all this long list of what a great person he was, and then all the great things that he did. You know, about following, and Jesus said to the Pharisees, "You tithe mint, and anise, and cumin, but you omit the weightier matters of the law, you know, love and justice and mercy. These you ought to have done, and not left the others undone." In other words, it's not a matter of you need to quit tithing these spices and do this. It's you keep doing this because this is right, but you've got to do this as well because this is more important. And so the Jews, keeping the law was important, but they made the keeping of the law the be-all, end-all of everything. In other words, if I just keep the law, that makes me right because I'm a good law keeper. And they missed the whole point of the law, which was to point people to Christ and prepare them for Christ. You just didn't receive remission of sins because you made a sacrifice. You had to have faith in the system and in the God who told you to make the sacrifice. But the Jews had resorted just to, for example, in the book of Malachi, they just resorted to saying, well, sacrifice is good enough, but I don't have to follow the other aspects of sacrifice. In other words, it don't have to be the very best. I'll find this old limping blind, this old blind limping goat, and I'll give that as a sacrifice. So what was their faith in? Their faith was in the sacrifice, was in the act, and not in the God of the act. You see? And by the way, anybody can be guilty of that. Members of the church can be guilty of that. That we're right because we do this. We sing without instrumental music. We take Lord's Supper every Sunday. We teach the plan of salvation. We don't have women leadership. In the church. We do this. Therefore, we're right, and therefore we're going to go to heaven. It doesn't work that way. We can no more put faith in right actions than others can put faith in wrong actions. Right? We still do what we do because of our faith in God. And we realize at the end of the day, as Luke 17:10 says, when you've done all that you've been commanded to do, you still have to say, we are unprofitable servants. We've only done what is our duty to do. If you can do it all and do it perfectly, you still don't deserve to go to heaven. It never works that way. And so we have to be on guard against these exact same mindsets that can lead us astray, even though on the outside we're doing what is right. Okay, we'll go to the next lesson next week. On page 125, the wisdom of God, or wisdom of men versus the wisdom of God.